Any other comments, questions for the good of the order? Okay. You may have seen it, and Matt, welcome. Matt DeVore from DOJ has joined us, so as to be able to answer questions that might arise that are in his sphere of influence. And you may not have seen it, or you may have, Jeff, just, I don't know, late morning sent out a sort of crib version of the key provisions within each section. And I actually think that's potentially a helpful outline for walking through. So I'm going to spare reading this, all the draft language with you, but again, want to walk through each section at a high level and see if folks have any feedback. So with that said, I'm going to just jump right in. Let me actually start this way. I'm going to actually ask those of you on the advisory committee, and maybe one representative from OSU or others could jump in. What's your sort of 30,000 foot level? How did the draft language strike you overall? Pretty positive, generally in the, are we in the ballpark? Any overall high level reactions? Let me just take you as you're on my screen. Bob, any reactions to that?
Overall, I think it's relatively good in a lot of sections. The section that I think is giving us the most heartburn is the accountability section. I think there's a bunch of work that needs to be done and clarification there. So I would highlight that. The other thing I'll note up front is that I think folks are okay without the protection language. We've had a meeting about that today, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Mark, but I think folks agreed that we don't need to put in the protective language, assuming we can get the language right around the accountability.
Thanks, Bob. Keith, 30,000 foot level, how did it strike you?
I'm comfortable.
Thanks. Katie or Paul Odenthal, or Shannon, any overall reactions?
I think, sorry, I'll just talk.
Yeah.
I think for the most part, we were pleased and felt like it followed along with what was submitted. I think we've got, probably like everyone else, we've got a few little sections that we found some inconsistency, but for the most part, that was pretty good.
Great. Mark.
Yeah, I thought it tracked pretty well. Generally, I thought sections 1 through 12 were pretty close to what we talked about before, with a few spots here and there. In particular, just wanted to make sure we're clearly tied to those 4 foundational documents that we've talked about, including this one. And then, to be honest, the whole thing with the state forester, I think I understood the intent, but it seemed a little belabored, maybe, but or maybe I'm not fully understanding what the intent was for that purpose, but it seemed disproportionately long for their role in this, which I get there's an interim role. Anyway, those are some initial reactions to it, I think. And yes, as Bob said, we've had different conversations about having protections in there among this group, and I think Bob and I both landed that it was more arm wrestling than it was beneficial to it, and the foundational documents describe what everybody's intent is, and that's what we would be connected to and relying on.
Thanks, Mark. Colin, any initial reactions?
Yeah, I've just kind of given it a quick initial review, and it seems pretty close. I think there's some areas that need some clarification. I think the judicial review section needs some clarification, just so that there's no room for interpretation there. And I did have a question. It looked like in the mission statement section, the mission statement related to tribal involvement changed a bit, got narrowed down from the legislative concept that I saw to this draft. So I was just curious if there was had been any discussion related to that.
Great, let's take that up. Thanks for flagging it, and we'll take it up as we get to that section. We'll kind of be a little methodical about how we approach raising these issues. Anything anyone else wanted to weigh in with or chime in, sort of high level reactions? DSL? Anyone else?
We're feeling like it's pretty close. There's a couple of things that need some cleanup, but we thought that the essence of what the committee had talked about was represented pretty well.
Great. And as I said at the outset, we'll make sure to circle with Paul and Melissa as well, since they're not able to be here. And I, at least from Melissa, have one or two things to flag that she's texted me. So we'll do so as we go along. With that said, anything on, let's just take it one section at a time here. Section 1, cross-referencing to the FMP. Going once, twice, 3 times. I'm going to assume silence is acquiescence.
No, silence is you can't
No.
find your mute button.
All right.
You know better than that.
Now's your time. There you go. You got to find that mute button early, buddy.
Yeah, I'll leave it off. Actually, just on the summary, I realize the summary is exactly what it is, and it disappears. I would just say that the fact that it flags the Administrative Procedures Act does not apply is an unfortunate summary, because that's catching a lot of people's eye, but it doesn't capture what is in there. So just as a flag for a problem we're gonna face right off the bat. Section 1 does not give me any concern, although I am curious whether, as per ORS 526-455, Forest Management Plan, does that also include an expectation that it's an administrative rule under the ORS?
That's something that Matt and I have not talked through. And so if Matt, you've got a response to that, that's great. If you don't, then we'll have to look at it and double check. I can tell you it was not intended to have trigger any rulemaking requirements.
Yeah, and Bob, are you asking about in section 1 where there's the cross-reference to 526?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm curious, because I mean, we were anticipating that the FMP would be an administrative rule ultimately, but so I was curious if that's where that lives. Apparently not. So that needs to put that in the parking lot.
Okay. Yeah, my initial response would be that where the later section says that the rulemaking requirements don't apply to this authority, that would then mean that the FMP is not a rule, even though it's defined in 526. But that's, yeah, certainly something we can talk a little bit more about.
I was curious about the section 1 language referencing that 526.455 definition of a forest management plan. That definition includes forest management plan shall include the schedule for implementing the forest management plan. And I think in discussion with OSU, the plan was to include that schedule, a harvest schedule, not in the forest management plan itself, but in a biennial operations plan. So I just wanted to make sure that that was consistent.
Okay, we'll have to spend some time with OSU on that.
And can Jeff and Malia, can we have you be point? All of us will take notes to capture this. As Malia, as you observed, this is all going to be changing, and we're working under short time horizons here. So I want to make sure we don't lose issues. We'll keep high level notes, but where there are specific feedbacks that need to be connected, on items, that'd be good if you could track those and follow up directly. So Jeff, you're on that one. Okay, anything else on section 1?
Not on section 1, I guess, Peter, just a caveat, I suppose, but having read it this morning, I'm not sure, I'm partly here this afternoon hoping to listen and learn and better understand what's in it. It doesn't mean I've gotten to the point where I can flag everything that is catching my attention, because I still feel like I'm digesting it. So when you say sort of section 1, good, end, close, that's fine for sort of a process for the moment, but it's not.
It's not your final approval. Understood.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
All right, let's move on to section 2. And if we're able to, yeah, anything on section 2? Bob?
Well, section 2 is big. I have a couple of
Yeah.
things here. One, and this is something I talked about with Jeff previously, there's no expectation the Elliott is going to be reduced in size, but the language throughout this document says any subsequent expansion, reduction, or exchange of land if are authorized, ... If there's no expectation the Elliott's ever going to be reduced in size, I'm not sure why we need reduction in there. I understand why it sort of fits with that sort of chain, but any swap should result in equal or more, not less. So maybe that's just to capture sort of the incidental, you're off by a couple of acres, but I think that will capture people's eyes. Number 2, I like the way this is framed generally, but I would note that it's interesting that 2A, sort of the mission, I like it up there. There's 2A and B. B is sort of repeated down in the management policies, section 3, but the biodiversity, natural resource stuff doesn't repeat down there. So it's sort of interesting that one part of that does sort of get captured in the policies, the other part doesn't. We had it in both in our draft. And then the last thing is trying to read some notes here. Second, shoot. There are some concerns about the public access and the way it's written sort of makes it subservient to logging. I think there's a recognition that obviously when you're doing logging, you're going to have to address public access and public safety. But I think there's just a little bit of a concern there about the way it's phrased.
Where are you, Bob?
Where are you? Yeah, can you be more specific, Bob?
3C, allow public access for recreational and educational purposes compatible with the scientific and conservation purposes of the forest.
What would you
that
rather?
That is the agreed upon language. There was just some concern raised by our collective that I'm not sure that can really be fixed, honestly.
No. I think that does reflect the language that the working group agreed to.
Yeah, no, I agree there. And then there was just a question. I think we maybe need some clarity down lower. The forest is supposed to be self-sustaining, but I think, I want to make sure that it's clear that that doesn't mean that we can up the cut either. I mean, the cut's driven by the science. It's not driven by we need a whole bunch more money. We want to do a bunch of things. Therefore, we're going to start to up the cut. So I just want to make sure that is really clear in the legislation.
So
Where again are you?
Yeah, so are you proposing, I mean, I see that you're on, let's see, H, I think,
Yeah.
and self-sufficiency, 3H. maintain financial self-sufficiency, forest management entity capable of operating and overseeing forest necessary infrastructure. All of these, I'm assuming, are consistent with the mission, which, right, may address that, or are you proposing an amendment? You know, I'm not asking for specific language, but are you needing a change here?
I don't think so, but I think the concern, the way people are reading it, and again, sort of floated this around a small group now, is, could this justify, in the name of sort of researching rural economies and or meeting the priority of making money, to support the forest, can that justify changing the harvest levels? Can that become the driver? It's not supposed to be. And so how do we make sure that that is clear? Yes, it's supposed to be self-sustaining, and yes, it's supposed to research its impact on rural economies, but that cannot necessarily be used as a driver to start to drive up harvest levels either.
I think it's clear to me that we can't up the cut because the operations plan would need to be consistent with the habitat conservation plan as well as the proposal from the college. But I think that the issue might just be communicating that to others.
Thanks, Colin. And Colin, while you're off, do you want to speak to what sounded like a potential modification to the tribal language here?
Sure. So section 2(3)G is the language related to tribal partnerships, and that's quite a bit different than the language that was in the legislative concept. The legislative concept was, I feel, it was written more broadly to include partnerships and research and demonstration of tribal forest practices, not just culture. That feels broader to me. And the language here doesn't mention, where in the concept, it also mentions, as well as providing opportunities for tribal governments and tribal members to harvest traditional forest products and engage in traditional tribal practices. That's completely left out of the draft legislation, and I think that's really important. The language that was in the concept was at least here with our tribe, it was vetted by our natural resources and cultural staff. So if possible, I'd like to stick to that language. And I'm just curious if there was any discussion in drafting this or why that language was strayed from.
So I'm gonna ask Malia to jump in, because she was tracking the wordsmith. I hadn't noticed the difference yet until you started calling it up. So maybe she can clarify what went in and where the change happened.
So Jeff, I'll just add, I've been kind of going back to the last draft. I think that change happened in this group before it was submitted, because the language that's in here is consistent with what was submitted. So I think we had that conversation in November, maybe at the last meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Malia?
Yeah, so the language that was submitted, it says, seeking active partnerships with tribal governments in research and demonstration of traditional tribal cultural practices and ecological knowledge. That was what was submitted to LC, and the request, the change that we did request from LC was to add so that it read demonstration of traditional and contemporary tribal cultural practices and ecological knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I'm inclined to agree with Katie that what had happened was there was discussion amongst this group that led us to language that is pretty accurately reflected in the draft we have right now for this piece.
Okay, let me maybe follow up with you on that. I'd like to go back and look at emails and look at what language it was that we had reviewed internally.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah,
But
the
even-
contemporary,
Especially, I think in particular, the harvest of cultural materials by tribal members is something that's going to be really important for us, and we'd like to make sure that gets included in the legislation.
okay.
Noted, Colin, and it sounds like Malia would be a point person on that. And
Yeah, that's fine.
great, Keith, and then Bob, I'll come back to you per your chat.
Yeah, in fact, I have one sort of observation for Bob, and I know he is aware, but I'll do it anyway, and then ask for a reference here. Number one, I get the whole idea about reduction in size, Bob, but there's got to be some language that allows some minor reduction if there's a land swap, or I think you get hung up on. I think we all understand that the intent is that there is no reduction in size, and certainly no significant reduction in size. But that language, I'd argue that needs to be preserved in some manner, and you can wordsmith it to whatever works. I'm comfortable with that, but I'd be less than comfortable if we were just simply X-naying that completely out. And Bob, what is it? Will you reference me the part where you're concerned about cut, upping harvest, and I'll simply preface that with the conversation that Melissa and I had, and Jeff and Malia were there with the Coastal Caucus members last week, I think. It came up several times that their concern was that we weren't running back to the legislature, that the forest didn't run back to the legislature at intervals for more money. And so I think to truthfully, my bet is that legislatively that there's going to be some focus on harvest, and meeting their concerns that the forest self-sustains. And so I'm not arguing for increased harvest, but I do want us to get the language right and make sure that we get especially the Coastal Caucus, but folks who are concerned that this is a self-sustaining forest and not one that is going to be repeatedly back to the legislature with a handout. Jeff and Malia, I think I referenced that or said that well within our conversations, right?
Yes, I think so. It wasn't stated quite as politely, but yes.
Okay.
I appreciate that.
And Bob, I guess the question back to you, I think is also maybe in response to your chat, and I'm curious both where you would propose mention of the 4 foundational documents, and the more specific we can be about this, the better. And if that's there, does that mitigate the concern about changes in harvest volumes that would be inconsistent with each of those documents? I mean, so much of that is baked into the commitments that are made in the HCP, the FMP, presumably, as well as the research proposal.
Yeah, it does. I think it helps with that. And again, I'm trying to flag everything that's sort of come up in the last 6
Sure.
hours to some of this we need to go back and think about. So I'm not necessarily going to fight for all of this stuff per se. But yes, I think that helps. I don't know where it goes exactly. I think it should be in one of the early sections. I think it would just help. And I realize that's kind of non-regulatory language, but I think somewhere in there saying, I mean, maybe actually it kind of is that the Elliott will be managed under 4 foundational documents, including this legislation, and they are as follows, boom, 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 boom. I think that could go somewhere in section, either a new section 2 and move it down, or in section 2 in the early part. And then the other thing I noted that I just picked up on, but maybe I'm just missing it, is we did have language in there about keeping the Elliott a public forest in perpetuity. I don't think that's there anymore. I think that needs to go back in. But maybe I'm missing it.
I don't think it's there, but I don't recall it being there in what was submitted to Ledge Council either.
It was
I don't
definitely, it was,
recall that being a part of the legislation, and I, will certainly look into this more, but I do know that the legislature can't direct future legislatures for policy. And so I think putting into statute a policy intent of anything into perpetuity is something that we'd have to be really thoughtful about. And so my first response is that it's possible that that's where some of, that's why it wasn't in the initial documents, is just that sort of our inability to direct future legislative action that way. But Bob, to your point of, having an intent, et cetera, about the forest remaining in public ownership, I know that we've had that, that's clearly been demonstrated in land board desire and direction as to why we're going through this process. And so, and it looks like Matt has his hand up, so he may have a good idea as to, what's a policy solution to this that can be put in black and white or not.
Thanks, Malia. And Bob, to respond to your point about maintaining it in public ownership in perpetuity, Section 15 maintains the statute
Right.
530.450 that says the forest is withdrawn from sale except as provided in the exchange statutes. So I think that is kept in there that would provide some protection for the potential against the future.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and we did have some discussion about that internally and made sure that it was kept in, so that there wouldn't be a change in that foundational piece that led to this outcome.
Bob, did that answer your question?
no, that, I guess the question then to you is, we definitely talked about it. It wasn't in one of the drafts, may have fallen out somewhere, but I think articulating that public forest thing, has been foundational to this whole process. Can you think of a way, and would anybody have objections if we to put into Section 2, something along the lines of to create a public forest? Is there any language we can get in there that makes legal sense and captures that goal without running afoul of future legislators? Because every single one of these things in here creates an obligation that a future legislature would have to undo. It creates obligations for future legislatures on its face. So I guess the question is, is there a way to get to that language somehow?
I think that the way that ORS 530.450 is getting there to say this land isn't going to be disposed of. One of the pieces that we had been talking about was revising 530.450 a little bit further so that it doesn't have the tie to the rest of 530, 510, but it's its own standalone statute. And I certainly think there's some more wordsmithing we could do in there to make it more clear that the intent is that it remain in public ownership. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, whether that goes in Section 15 or it's more of a foundational piece that goes up into Section 2, I would look for direction from the drafters and Malia and Jeff.
Yeah, we'll have to work that through. Other working group members have an opinion about the energy that should be spent on that?
Yeah, I'm supportive of making it clear that one of the policies is to maintain the Elliott as a public forest, and I wonder if it would be possible to just add a section to that list of policies, stating a policy of maintaining the Elliott as a public forest. I mean, it wouldn't necessarily need to state that it be maintained in perpetuity, but that could just be added as one of the that list of policies.
I just say, I think it's important on a perception wise more than it is on a policy wise for folks that are reading it and aren't going to find that, nuanced language farther down in the bill.
Thanks, Kitty. Not hearing any objections, I think worth a little bit of attention here. And
Yep, we will give it that.
great. And Melissa, I think is listening in at this point, may not be able to weigh in, but I can imagine that for folks, that may be an important element of this as well from a perception perspective.
So before we leave section 2, with respect to section 2, we're going to look at that. We're going to look at the foundational document citation. We're going to touch base on the harvest, the cultural resource point that Colin raised. And we're going to have to go back and think about the reduction piece, and there's more to discuss there, but those are what we picked up in our notes.
The repetition of biodiversity was the other one, Bob, that you had flagged, I think, and I'm not sure how significant that was.
And I'll read through it again and get back to you on that. The other pieces of that first section do repeat, so it may just be formulaic. I'll get back to you on that.
Thanks. Anything else on section 2?
Hey, Peter.
Yeah.
This is Ryan, man. I just on that public ownership piece, I know this isn't statutory. We're talking about what's going to be written on paper, but I just wanted to offer that I can make sure Treasurer Reed and I'm sure the other land board members testify on the record to the fact that public ownership and public access was always foundational, and at least we can make sure the legislative record reflects that to reinforce whatever may be missing in the legislative language.
Good. Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate that. And just so everybody sees it, Paul Odendahl put in the chat one potential suggestion here, noteworthy, the mission of the Elliott, the mission of establishing the Elliott State Research Forest is to create an enduring, publicly owned, world-class research forest that ... So there may be ways like that to include this.
And I think that's actually where it was originally. I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
That's where it lived.
We should keep on going.
Yep.
We got it. We're good. I don't think there's any disagreement about it. We'll just figure out how to do it.
Okay. Anything on 2A? Just calling that out. All right, section 3, Board of Directors, composition, terms, and appointment criteria.
I just want to note that this is a minor miracle that we should all stop and appreciate that this section.
And I think Malia caught that there is a word or two missing from section 3, sub 3D, which is the
It's in the
criteria
bubble
for
pieces.
appointment.
Yeah,
So why don't you fill everybody in on what you caught there? That isn't
yeah,
it?
so throughout the document, it references policies that have to be in compliance with section 2, and which is where the mission and the management policies are. I think that it is often listed as, it reads, as demonstrated in or as supported in, et cetera, in the mission and management policies of forest. Oh, no, sorry. This is
in success.
right before. It currently reads in subsection D, as Jeff said, that the members need to have a full complement of experience, expertise, et cetera, and demonstrated interest in the mission and management policies of the forest. When this group was having that discussion, the intent was that members that would be appointed to this committee would have to have a demonstrated interest in the success of the Elliott as a research forest. And somewhere we lost that word, kind of, that they needed to have a demonstrated interest in the success of the mission and management policies of the forest. And so I think we'll just be
We didn't know whether that mattered
requesting
or
to,
not.
yeah.
Thumbs up from Katie.
Yeah, I like that.
I do too.
Good catch.
Actually, one question on this too. Everything in there makes sense, but what I don't see is sort of the provision that allows people to submit their own names or, how do we do self-nominations? Because it wasn't meant to be just exclusively OSU and the land and the stakeholders making recommendations. There was also, there needs to be a, do we need
Yeah, that was
language
an
there to allow
important
for that?
element to call back as well. I know that.
Well, I don't think that the current language precludes it.
Correct.
It says that it consult with and consider input. So it doesn't preclude it. It certainly would be up to the board. We can amend the language, or we could take this as an authority of the board of directors to have a process that if somebody wants to self-nominate, they will forward it too. It doesn't have to be resolved in the statutory language, but it could be.
I guess I would just look to Matt for what other, what's the standard procedure there? And just to mimic that.
Yeah, and Bob, to that point, I think that was our request of Aurora in several instances was, what is the standard language and how are other natural resource agencies, how are their statutes written to address these things? But on the specific point of self-nomination, I think we can ask Matt and Aurora both to go back and say, hey, as this is written here, is this a standard language that does allow for that, and make sure that that's able to happen.
Yeah, I think self-nomination is probably the wrong term. I think it's probably just apply.
Matt, any initial reactions that you'd like to share?
No, well, I'm certainly happy to go look at other agencies and try to see how their language works.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate that. Jeff,
Hey.
something else?
I was just going to say, when it's the governor's appointment, there's a whole process with forms and everything that you submit to the governor's appointments person. And that puts you in a bucket for consideration. The land board isn't going to have that fine a process. So that's something that I think, again, this is something that the board of directors could create a process for making sure that the land board gets a set of names that is reflective of everybody that's mentioned in the statute.
Thanks. Keith, did you have something else?
Yeah, I just to kind of throw it out. Is everybody comfortable with the phrase full complement? Personally, I'm not sure what the heck that means, or I think it's, and I know we had a discussion on that already, and it's cutting hairs. I'm not particularly sure it needs to be in there, but I know where we're going, and I just wonder if at some point we end up in a or that it just ends up complicating things. So I can well live with it. It's not my perfect world, and I just wondered where everybody else is on that.
Anybody, any other reactions to full complement? Mark?
Well, I agree. It's well intended. It has some ambiguity. I think the opening verb there, endeavor to appoint, suggests that that's the goal, but so I guess it leaves it open to the best interpretation of what a full complement is, and maybe the emphasis varies over time into the future.
And it may not tie the hands of, the appointment process.
There's also a semantic issue here when you read it. I mean, it obviously means that the board as a whole has a full complement. When you read it, you could read it as individual members or the full board having that full complement. It's a wordsmithing thing.
So no objections on dealing with this from our perspective, just to remember that this is a -1 amendment that will happen in committee, and everything you take on is one additional level of complexity for the bill that will be introduced. So
I would also say in this particular case, are we more comfortable with full complement, which is perhaps bit of a well-intentioned but ambiguous term, or are we more comfortable asking LC, can you make this more specific, and then just getting whatever language they give us? Because once we have the language in the F1 in the -1, that will be the language that we have.
I would submit that's a recipe that might lead us to a place we don't want to be.
Yep.
Careful what you ask for.
All right, I'm good.
I'm asking you what you're asking for, and I will do whatever you would like.
We heard you,
Well
and
made, Malia.
everybody's good. I'm going to move on, but I do want to flag Melissa raised a question in this section, and it related to 3A, appointment of voting members for terms of 4 years. She wondered if that is for full terms, or is it, dealing with the idea of somebody stepping in and filling a vacancy for a year. Would they be term limited out after 5 years, say, for example, or not?
I can tell you this language is very similar to what was done with the OWEB board when it started up in 1999 when I was the director, and that was the way it was interpreted. A term was, the initial board had staggered terms, and I think that's where Melissa is headed. And if you were appointed to a 2-year term and then a 4-year term, you only got 6 years. And if we want something different than that, then we're going to have to be with more clarity.
I can live with that.
Good. We'll circle with Melissa. She needed more time to look through it, but she did flag that one. So I wanted to mention it, and I'm not in a position to advocate one direction or another on her behalf.
We will flag it. And it's not a small thing, because the initial board, there will be some members on the initial board of directors that only have a 1-year term. Some that have a 2 and some that have a 3. So it will limit somebody to a 5-year total, if that's of concern.
Okay.
Can be worked out.
Anything else on 3? Okay, I'm going to try to keep us moving here.
Oh, I was just gonna say, Shannon put some, I think Shannon put something in the chat. I just wanted folks to kind of see around that full
Sorry, I was reading Melissa's text, trying to see people, read the language and see people. So thanks for looking out. Shannon, what'd you have?
Yeah, thanks, Katie and Peter. Just kind of related to this question of the full complement of relevant experience and how that's determined, the qualifications to be on the board of directors. I just wanted to share that that OSU has gotten feedback from multiple areas that having research representation in some way is felt to be important in the successful functioning of the research forest, along with the full range of perspectives. So I just put that comment in the chat. I'm not sure where that's determined or how, but that kind of gets at a little bit of what does full complement mean.
And this is just to be clear, different than the dean.
Different than the dean. Yes, we've gotten feedback that having a voting representative of the research community would be important.
Yeah, and I think when we had the discussions a couple, 3 times around the circle on this, we said that would be part of the nomination process for a full complement of making sure that there were names in the hopper from OSU that were, or anybody of researchers that could be part of the complement of timber, environmental research, recreation interests on the board, without having to go down the road of specifying particular interests, particular seats.
Great, thanks for that clarification.
Thanks, Shannon. Okay. Moving on to section 4. Questions, comments? With the note of Malia ringing in your ears. Careful what you ask for. Amendment's fine, but be prudent about what you're asking for. Okay. Anything on 4? All right. Good. Section 5. Short and sweet. All right. Section 6. Katie?
So for sub D, oh wait, sorry, I read this wrong. And I see that what I wanted is there. So
That's the best kind about it.
Yeah, when I read it yesterday, I did not read it this way, but it does say selection process led by the university, and I missed that. So never mind.
All right, check, took care of it.
So,
Anything else?
yeah, I did want to point out to Katie that something that you had suggested for section 6 sub H, little h, capital E, education plans. There was a
yeah.
drop of a word there that you had suggested, and we can go back and see about that if it's important to you all. I wasn't sure exactly how important it was.
I think the bigger piece, I'm not sure what the drop of the word is on E, but the biggest piece was
Public education plans.
Oh, I think if we have that reference to the section 2, it's clear that it isn't. So folks are aware of the education plans. We had some concerns that this is really about those public facing ones that are mentioned in the forest, what are they called? Forest management policies, and not like our curriculum based degree programs. And so I think that reference to section 2 does that, Jeff.
Okay, great. And then for Bob's benefits, large H, capital H has a reduction language, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Little h, sub H.
Yeah, it repeats throughout.
Yeah,
Okay.
it comes up a number of places.
So, I mean, I think this is a section we're gonna come back with a couple of questions on, so I just want to flag that initially. This is also a place where you could have language potentially about the process in terms of public involvement, which I don't see here. It's not clear in this section, and it's not clear elsewhere that, you know, these things are going to go through a public review process and what that review process will be.
What things, you mean the different plans?
Yeah, you have approve or deny
Okay.
budgets, operational reports, all these other plans. And, you know, we spent a lot of time with OSU looking at what that public process would look like. But in this document, there isn't. So, you know, our assumption is all of these things are going to go through notice, public comment, and be formalized. They're not going to be a board of 9 people sitting there, you know, making these decisions without public input.
So was this language or discussion a piece of the discussion that we talked about before and didn't make it in, or is this a kind of a new piece for this section? I'm wanting to track. I understand your point. I'm just trying to figure out where we lost it, or if it's new.
Well, there's no language in there really about public meetings and those kinds of things, but it's something we've talked about throughout. I'm not sure if we got lost or either, but we've talked throughout this process about subjecting, and OSU has been, I think, pretty clear that they're going to go through public notice and comment. It should be in here.
And
So
it should
Bob,
be
can
in
I
here.
ask?
Oh, go ahead.
So can I ask Bob, if you keep going in that same section, it leads over to page 7. It says that the board shall conduct at least 6 business meetings a year. It is clarified that the board of directors, public meeting laws, et cetera, applies. And so those will be public meetings that they're required to have at least a half a dozen times a year. I think we did that so that it was more than once a quarter. That was a conversation I remember happening in this group, like how many public meetings needed to happen. So the language about that this board will conduct at least 6 business meetings a year. It does clarify that the meetings that this board and therefore their meetings fall under public meeting laws. And then also within that section, it says that there's language that says promote transparency around decisions concerning the forest, including forums to provide input. So does that at least start to get there?
No, I don't think it gets all the way there, because I mean, again, I mean, there's an expectation of public process for these decisions. This is a public agency, and so there is an expectation that we will go through, you know, notice, comment, and have an opportunity. That also gives the board and others that opportunity to it forces people to come in and state objections or concerns as well in advance, and that sets up the potential or precludes the potential for litigation later on. So I want to make sure that, you know, I don't think just holding a public meeting, we hold public meetings, the public can't comment at most of them. But I think, you know, you want to put an operations plan, a recreation plan out for public input. You don't want to just have this be an insular process in which OSU, the board of directors, adopt things without actually giving the public an opportunity to participate in a formal way in those decision-making processes.
And I think that is what we were trying to get to with the language about providing forums to provide input, but it sounds like we need to keep tweaking that a bit.
Well, that, or we have to make a decision as a group about whether this is something you entrust the board of directors to set up processes and make the statute broad enough that the intention's there.
Doesn't a forest management plan, for example, Bob, have to have, as a public forest, have to have a chance for public comment? Isn't it?
That's not clear to me in this, because we've accepted it from the APA, and, you know, I mean, we were assuming the forest management plan was going to be a rule, but you know, that's not clear either. So I think there is a gap here between just having, you know, transparency, which is a vague term, and, you know, you can consider just having a meeting like this transparent, and actually delineating that, you know, yes, these documents are going to go through, you know, notice and comment and adoption procedures. And again, that sets up, you know, the opportunity for the public to raise concerns in a proactive way, as opposed to simply litigating after the fact as well.
So let's take a look at this, and you know, there's two directions. One is you could have a statute that tries to legislate the entire process, or the other is to have a statute that makes clear that the agency is responsible and expected to create a process that meets certain targets that are set in the legislation for public input and process. So we can.
I think that's one of the dangers of exempting from the Administrative Procedures Act, is that you're taking away sort of these standardized processes that everyone's used to, and then not necessarily, you know, and then leaving it up to sort of chance as to what replaces it. And, you know, I think I do question why we are jettisoning the APA, because those are kind of the standardized procedures. But it does put us in a position of sometimes recreating the wheel around these things, or leaving it to chance, which I don't think really is acceptable, you know.
There's a middle ground. We're not jettisoning the APA. The bill exempts the rulemaking requirements of the APA and the agency from the rulemaking requirements, which are a substantial staffing and timing issue, and are very well suited, in my opinion, to policy development. But the operationalizing of a forest and biennial operation plans and annual operations reports and things like that, when there was discussion about how it would functionally work and what the budget implications would be, both were significant for the forest. So the goal here was to try and establish expectations, and not disagreeing with you at all on the public input and public process. No concerns about that whatsoever. It really is trying not to pick up all of the baggage that has been set up for all of the policy making bodies, like the Board of Forestry and Fish and Wildlife Commission and the Water Resources Commission and the Department of Environmental Quality, that they go through with rulemaking process. And that is a whole different kettle of fish. And so finding some middle ground here is what we were after.
Yeah, I hear you, Jeff, but I think this is a place where we'll be getting back to you Thursday on kind of.
We'll work a little bit in the meantime on it with some ideas, unless we hear a disagreement from any of the working group members that we shouldn't. It needs more discussion.
Katie?
So mine's on a different topic. So finish.
Okay, so I've
this.
got, I think I saw Colin, then Mark, then Katie.
Yeah, so different area of section 6, but there's several places in the legislation that mention consistency with the proposal for managing the forest that the university submitted to the state land board on December 8th, 2020, or the most current version of the proposal submitted on December 8th, 2020. And that's, I just bring that up because it's mentioned several times, similar language, but it's not really clear to me what that means. Does that mean that it's one of several versions that were submitted on December 8th, or is it a version that was submitted after December 8th? If so, which version is that? Is that a living document? Can OSU update that document going forward? And in which case you'd have a new current version of that document? Yeah, it just raises a lot of questions as to what exactly that means.
Yeah, so the research proposal that was submitted by OSU was submitted at the December Land Board meeting in 2020. However, that proposal has since been updated. And so I think the intent here is to, rather than call out a date specific version of the document, to allow for, as that document becomes updated, to always be referring to the most updated, most current form of the document. And so I think the initial language is, looking here. I think it may come before here because it calls out the fact that it's the version that was submitted in December of 2020 and then updated. And then I think the rest of the references are the applicable version. And I think that's the reasoning and the intent behind that.
Yeah, still not really clear to me which version that is, because I think I've seen a copy of the December 8th version. But if there's a more recent applicable version, I'd be interested in seeing what that is. And I'm still curious if it can continue to be updated moving forward.
Let's double check that with Matt and the drafters. I think that we need to double check that. I'm not positive with whether, because I think that and members of the advisory committee, my feeling was that the intent, at least as I heard your discussions, was that the land board approved a December 8th proposal that with certain amendments to be made, which were made in April, and that's the foundational document. And that revising that would need to go through some of the process that we've got established in the legislation.
Okay.
It just couldn't be done unilaterally.
Yeah, that could be a point of clarification as well, because there's the draft legislation, it states who approves updates to the forest management plan or the habitat conservation plan, but I think it's silent as to the research proposal itself.
Yeah, I think Malia's right, and I think that it's an inadvertent languaging that happened in the editing of the bill, to be honest. Thanks, Colin.
Yeah, thanks for flagging it. Mark? And then Katie, fast. Go ahead, Mark.
Oh, well, I've been jumping around. I had some questions and then I answered my own questions, but I think on this last point, oversight by the land board, there's approve and deny changes to the forest management plan, that HCP, it seems like that would be a place potentially to insert, and also weigh in on any proposed changes to the OSU proposal of December 8th modified or amended in April.
Thanks. Anything else, Mark?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, Katie?
Sorry, I was muted. The next one is subsection G. What was submitted was that carbon credits and easements must be consistent with the mission. And I think we'd like that added back in.
Okay, we can discuss that more with you. I think that was dropped because it was the authority of the board, just approving expansions, exchange, approving carbon credits or easements, approving forest management plan. But we can talk it through. I'll put it on the list.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a big issue to make sure that it's consistent with the research platform.
I'm sorry, Katie, can you give me that section again?
It is sub G.
Okay.
Capital G, right?
Yeah.
Correct. Okay, any other items to flag?
One point here, and I'm not sure if there's not enough public input protections already built into the cake or baked into the cake, but I'll throw Bob. I know that it's of great concern, and perhaps a simple route is simply on H under 6 little h to add to the beginning of that, seeking public input, or allowing for public input, the board shall approve or deny, blah, blah, blah. So if that's a hang up, it's a simple statement, and it doesn't, it is usable by the board then to kind of determine the appropriateness of that public input. And I think any board will think that public input is pretty appropriate.
Thanks for the suggestion, Keith. Colin?
All right, so this is pretty into the weeds. Sub H, big F and big I both had some language that I kind of struggled with as I was reading through them. F reads a forest management plan. And the board has authority to approve a forest management plan and any subsequent amendments to the forest management plan that the state land board has approved. And I wasn't really clear what that means. Does that mean that an amendment to the plan that has already been approved by the state land board, or does that mean the state land board has approved the amendments and then now the board is approving them? And I think it was a little bit more clear when I was reading the authority, section 10, the authority of the state land board. And as I understand it, the amendments would be approved by the board, the Elliott board, and then would be subject to approval by the state land board. So correct me if I'm wrong on that. And I guess if that's the case, maybe the wording could be just tweaked a little bit. The Elliott board would have authority to approve amendments subject to further approval by the state land board, something along those lines.
We'll look at the language again. It was discussed at length. The intention is to have the final action taken by the board of directors of the forest as being the entity responsible for the forest, and keeping the land board in the position of signing off on things, but not being the ultimate decision. And so the language is a little bit different than you would think about as a direct trail up to the state land board. But the intention is for the state land board to say, this is going to be fine with us, and then have the board of directors do a final agency action that can then be subject to judicial review. But that's wanting to honor the intention that it is the board of directors that runs this forest, not the state land board. Yeah. So we'll take another look at the relationship between those two, and Matt's worked on that closely. So we'll take another look and see if it can be.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense why it's written that way. It seems to me that the Elliott board itself would be in adopting those amendments. They would be deliberating and maybe making modifications to the proposed amendments. So it would, yeah, I guess the order of things is
Yeah.
a little confusing.
And I think inserted into that process that was envisioned was the discussion that this working group had, that they want that forest management plan amendments is something they want the land board to see and be involved in. And so we were trying to bridge.
Mhm. What was the discussion around having the state land board interjected into these decisions? I think I missed the legislative concept meeting, so I'm curious why that's the case. Why not just have the Elliott board have the sole and final say on those matters?
What I would say in response, Colin, is it's not the discussion, but the discussions around that relationship. But Mark, do you want to say quickly, were you coming off in like 30 seconds or less, kind of a quick summary of what the thinking was?
Well, I think just following up on your point, we talked about it at length numerous times. And initially it was sort of the land board was being brought in to resolve conflicts. And I think the discussion led to the land board could have a bigger role than just resolving conflicts, but rather, in so many words, giving their stamp of approval to what's going on, and that they are a little bit eyes and ears, but that was an appropriate role given that it's still a public and a state asset. But I think that was a little bit the sequencing and chronology of the conversation.
Thanks, Mark. And Colin, I think we could have some more offline conversations to, not because they need to be offline, just because we don't have a lot of time today to talk through that. But I think there's a number of folks that'd be willing to have more conversation about that.
Yeah, I think Peggy Lynch's comment in the chat boxes also reflects some of what I heard in that conversation.
And it looks like Bob Salinger wants to get in here. Bob.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm also curious about, are we considering a new forest management plan and amendment to amendment covers changes to an existing forest management plan. What about future forest management plans? Do they also kind of go through that process? And, again, a question about public involvement. There are major amendments and minor amendments. We just went through a situation with a state agency where they made a major amendment, in our opinion, to a agreement that had been forged 20 years ago with community input, without community input this time. And so I just want to make sure that we really, these are real concerns where, these things happen behind closed doors or without the public really having an opportunity, and they can blow up pretty badly. And so I just want to make sure that we really are clear on these things where the public actually enters the picture, and if that's required or if that's discretionary, because discretionary leads to all kinds of interesting outcomes. So there's two things there. One is future forest management plans. Those are different than amendments. And the second is where the public enters those processes.
Right, which was the initial point you had made on section 6.
Right, but it comes back here as well. I mean, it could be in any one of these places or all of them.
Noted. Thanks, Bob.
Just quick follow-up on that. It seems like the awkwardness in that language is coming from trying to call state land board approval, trying to make it seem that it's not what it really is. And I mean, ultimately, if the state land board has the ultimate say, then they have the ultimate say, and it would make more sense to me to just call it what it is and say that any of these authorities of the Elliott board are subject to final approval by the state land board. I mean, it seems like ultimately that's what it is, and I would prefer to just call it that rather than to make it seem like it's something different.
Thanks for the feedback, folks. Anything else on section 6? I want to keep us clipping as best I can. Not too quickly, though. All right. 7 and 8, Board of Directors. Annual report and requirement. Nothing on 7 and 8? Okay. Section 9, Land Board Oversight. Here we are. Questions, comments, concerns? Mark?
Well, I would just restate what I said before. Maybe there's a place in here to also add in the OSU proposal if that is to be amended or changed over time.
Thanks for flagging it. Just making a couple notes here. Anyone else? Section 9.
Whereas proven and deny amendments to the Habitat Conservation Plan. I thought we actually had in there approve or deny changes or new forest management plans as well. Where did that go to?
That's in number 3.
Number 3. Yep. Approve or deny forest management.
Sorry, it's right in front of my eyes. All right, apologies, missed it.
Good, helpful clarifications.
Yep.
All set here, thanks.
Okay. Anyone else on 9? Okay, moving on to section 10, Executive Director Responsibilities. Okay.
Yeah, Peter, this may be the wrong place for it, but I have a note here on this. It's not just the decisions being consistent with the forest management plan or HCP or foundational documents or whatever we want to delineate. It's also the implementation, so I think we need to capture that. I said this earlier as well. It's not just the decision-making process, it's also on the implementation side. And that's going to come up later in sort of the third-party right of litigation. We want to make sure that we make the right decisions that are consistent, and we want to make sure implementation. And take an extreme example. You can have a good operational plan, but you can go and clear cut in the wrong spot. That is not a decision. That's actually an implementation problem. So make sure we capture both ends of that equation.
Which number are you looking at specifically, Bob?
I am looking at
10, I think.
Yeah, unfortunately, my notes are all jumbled on the screen, so they appear all over the place. But yeah.
9.
You raised it during item 9 or in section 9, but also noted that it may be better housed elsewhere. So I don't think you were looking for an amendment to a specific measure here, but rather
Okay.
a new insertion somewhere.
Yeah.
Mark, did you have something? I'm sorry, you were on mute.
Yeah, I'm sort of reading, maybe it's in number 3 where it's about implementing the forest management operations.
This is section 9, item 3.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm in section 10.
Let me, so that,
I think Bob's comment was to section 10, subsection 9. And I think what Mark is saying is that there's language about the implementation of operations in subsection 3.
yep, you've got it. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I noted that as what Bob's speaking to is something that I saw that was missing overall. And it really stood out when I got to section 13, skipping ahead just a little bit, which is on the right of review. And what I saw is that it lists when there's a right of review, but it doesn't really specify what the standard of review is. And what I would expect to see somewhere is language that, the forest management plan shall be consistent with the goals or the policies, and that the operations plan shall be consistent with forest management plan, and that the management activities shall be consistent with the operations plan. I think that should be stated somewhere.
Can we hold that till we get to 13?
Sure, yeah, it does. I don't necessarily know that it needs to be in section 13, but
Okay, let me get us back on sort of sequential order, just to make sure I'm dotting the i's and crossing the t's, so to speak. So any further comments on section 9, which related to land board oversight? Section 10, executive director responsibilities. Noting the comments that Bob, you raised, and Mark, you identified as well. Okay. Section 11, powers authorized to the Elliott State Research Forest Authority. Okay.
I guess just a question. We talk about the Elliott State Authority, and is that different than a state agency? Or, I mean, we've talked about it sort of, is it a pseudo state agency? Or is there any, boilerplate language that would say, the Elliott State Authority, functions as a state agency? Or just, I guess I'm sort of struggling with what you say and what you don't say. And are there things by omission that are there as well? Or what? I'm way out of my league here. I just wonder if there's, how do you know what to say and what not to say, sort of, to make it.
So Matt, maybe you could talk a little bit about the steps we took to make sure that the authority would be considered an agency of the state as opposed to a corporation.
Yeah, the way that it's set up, it would be a state agency, a state department, a state entity. There's a few different ways that it could be labeled. I don't know that there was any particular reason that the designation authority was settled upon. I think that there were a few different options. We had been talking about this as a public entity, and I think we wanted to have something more definitive to say it's not just some vague entity, but it is an authority. So it would be a public body subject to all the same obligations as a department or a state agency. It's not a public corporation. It's not going down that path at all, but it is a department. So I don't know if does that answer your question, or were you looking for something?
No, that's actually really helpful. I guess my follow-up is that, is it possible or appropriate to put in there just that clarifying comment that it is basically a state agency, and all the wherewithals that apply to a state agency are applicable here?
And that gets a little bit more complicated because each, like a taxing statute, has its own definition of what a public body is, and the public meeting law has its own definition of a public body. And I don't know that we could say that this meets the definition of a public agency for all intents and purposes. But that's certainly something that I would be happy to look at more, or talk to legislative counsel about some more.
You're worried about what you're not seeing more than what you're seeing. Is that right, Mark?
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah. If we cover the accountability piece appropriately, and identify the public comment and meeting requirements, I think want you to think about what it is that, if those things are addressed adequately, what you aren't seeing that would raise the concern that you've got. If it's a latent concern or if there's something specific. Because I think we've tried to make sure we didn't run afoul. A generic statement, as Matt said, the generic statement isn't used for other agencies either. It's tailored for the difference between a natural resource agency or a taxing entity or whatever. So we've tried to stay out of hot water by having broad shape that could cause problems later, but be very clear about the public agency responsibilities of the research forest. And Legislative Council and DOJ, I mean, there was no ambiguity about what we were trying to accomplish there. The instructions were, this is not a public corporation. This is a state agency in name and being. So if you're still missing something in the process or anything comes up, we'd want to know. And we can look at it again just to double check, but I think they did a pretty good job. There's been hours and hours of discussion around that in the preparation of the draft.
Well, yeah, I'll keep thinking on it. I think sort of that public accountability and the rulemaking thing is partly where I'm going. So we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, let's get to that section, and then flagging maybe Matt or Malia, is authority defined somewhere per Bob's chat?
Not that I know of. I would go back up to section 3 of the draft that says the legislature is creating the Elliott State Research Forest Authority, which then makes it a public body created by the legislature and then invokes all of the obligations of a public body. But I don't know that we have a specific definition of what an authority is, or whether that meets another definition of public body. I can look at that more.
Thanks. Okay, double checking anything else on anything on section 11. Section 12, reimbursing of employees and board members. Okay, 13, APA provisions.
I think here, I think 13 is the challenging one. I think better that we meet. We're meeting on Thursday to kind of go through this section in particular, and then get stuff back to you rather than trying to delve down into it today from a conservation perspective.
That makes sense. I wondered if the folks who have been involved in the drafting and Matt, or if there are specific elements of this that, while you have Matt available to you, that wouldn't be helpful, at least to any questions or clarifications on the part of those that have been helping with drafting the language in terms of the intent of what's here.
Yep, Matt and I've talked, and maybe I'm going to take a high level swag at it, and Matt's going to follow in behind. And then Bob, I agree with you. I think that once we should talk details about this and see if there's adjustments to be made that we can come back to the group. And I want to make sure that Paul Beck is involved in that conversation, because he's been very active voice on this piece of it in the past. The goal that was established with Justice Department and Legislative Council was to create a right of appeal as an other than contested case to circuit court on very specific things, a third party right of action, and to be clear about what those things are and what they and delineate them specifically, so as to not so as to be very clear about what's in and what's out outside the box. And I think that's more or less what your starting point was, is you wanted to know what was eligible and what wasn't. At the same time, and that's what happens in section 3. Section 1 is trying to also be clear that there is no confusion that, at least as this draft is written, the rulemaking procedures and processes that are applied to policy natural resource agencies are not applicable to the forest. And that came from our perspective, that the forest is about, that this board of directors is there to manage the forest, not there to set state policy. And that rulemaking is much more applicable to the establishment of state policy that has broadscape implications for more than a certain number of acres. And that this board isn't a natural resource agency that's setting policy. And so it's making decisions about how to manage the forest. So we exempted the board from the rulemaking responsibilities associated and the process and the procedures and the appellate court process that follows that, when they were creating these or approving these specific plans A through F. So that's section 1. Section 3 then says for those same things, if it's not consistent, here's the right of appeal. And that appeal goes to circuit court, not up through a dispute resolution process or whatever. We tied it specifically to the Administrative Procedures Act because there's all sorts of established law around what's the standard of review and the timing and all of the things, the mechanics that everybody is very familiar with in the natural resource world around Administrative Procedures Act, other than contested cases. So rather than kind of starting from scratch and having all the interpretation issues that come with that, we tried to use established APA law to be the guidepost. That was part of a very significant discussion we had with some of the members of the working group individually, and I think collectively, about whether the APA should be invoked at all. But in the end, that's what we did do that for that reason, because of the established precedent. And then Matt, you can follow in on that, but I think you should explain briefly what sub 2 was that's stuck in the middle between that rulemaking exemption and the other than contested case APA process that we were clear about. Section 2 is a late arrival. And then I'll be quiet.
Yeah, Jeff, I think that was a great summary of 1 and 3. For subsection 2, I would just add that there could conceivably be agency actions that would impact an individual's rights, and what I would be concerned about here is the due process rights. If some action of the agency in some conceivable way impacted a due process right of an individual, that they should have some right of recourse, and subsection 2 makes it clear that that is still protected, even though some of the other provisions of the APA would not be, wouldn't apply to the authority.
And I guess the last piece is, I think you did mention last time, Bob, that the sub D of section 3 about entry into a contract was not enough, and you had concerns about that. And it was, we didn't make the adjustments to that, not because we aren't interested in talking about it. It just went through this way. So we recognize your point on that, and we should talk some more with the working group about that.
Well, Colin articulated very clearly. I'm sorry, Colin, you get your hand up. Go ahead.
No, I think you're giving me a compliment. Go ahead.
No, I thought Colin articulated very clearly what I was trying to get at with his hierarchy there, that, the forest management plan needs to be consistent with these documents, and the operational plans need to be consistent with the forest management plan, and the actual operations on the ground need to be consistent. That's what I'm trying to get at here, so that it's very clear that all these things need to sequence up and be consistent throughout. And I think that language was really good at getting at that in kind of plain English.
Yeah, and I would jump in here and say that I think that the intent under 3, small a, and then capital A, mission and management policies, I'm sorry, small a would be the forest management plan needs to be consistent with the rest of the statute as well as the OSU proposal. And then under small b, the biennial operations plan, recreation plan, or educational plan need to be consistent with the FMP. Under subsection C, the habitat conservation plan needs to be consistent with the mission and management policies of the Act. So I think that what the LC was trying to do was to get to that, but maybe not doing so in as clear of language as Colin offered.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think it's pretty clear what this implies. All the things that you just said, I think it just needs to be stated that way. You know, this section makes it clear that the action is reviewable if it's materially inconsistent, but it just needs to state somewhere that there's a requirement that the actions not be materially inconsistent, or that they be consistent, or that they not be inconsistent, whichever standard we want to use. I think they all essentially mean the same thing, unless you're a lawyer, and then you can probably argue about that for days. But yeah, I think there should just be nothing left to the imagination here, and I think that's pretty standard for forest management statutes on the federal side, at least, to have a section right up top that states there will be a forest management plan. Management activities will be consistent with the forest management plan. In this case, we have a policy document. The forest management plan would need to be consistent with the policy. The operations plan would need to be consistent with the forest management plan, and then contracts and management activities would need to be consistent with the operations plan and the forest management plan.
Thanks, Colin. And sounds like a willingness to continue to think through this together, and the intent, I think, is shared, but clarifying the language may be necessary. And I want to flag question from Bob. Matt, this may be best answered by you. Definition: is there a definition of materially inconsistent versus just inconsistent? Is there a substantive reason to use one versus the other?
The intent, as I understood it, I don't know that there's a definition. There's certainly not a definition in this LC, and there's probably not going to be a statutory definition that we could rely on. So we'd probably be looking at whatever legislative intent is expressed during the consideration of the bill, as well as dictionary definitions of those terms. But I think the intent there was to say that an inconsistency could be any minor inconsistency, but the intent was to focus on material inconsistencies, things that are more substantial than just a clerical error or something that's minor.
Yep. My only thoughts on that would be that the OSU and the Elliott Authority and the executive director receive deference on how they are interpreting their own policies and plans and operating plans. And that when, you know, if something goes to judicial review and there's ambiguities as far as what the forest management plan means, that the court isn't second guessing the managers.
Right, and that ties back to the established precedent under the Administrative Procedures Act interpretations.
Yeah, there will generally be a deference to an agency's interpretation of its own rules or policies. That's just something that is going to come with a state agency.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Colin, for raising that.
I just say here, I think materially is kind of a superfluous word in the sense that if it's a small clerical error, then and you raise it, then OSU is going to fix it. You know, I mean, if these are minor things that were just minor errors, you're not going to take down a plan on a minor error. You're gonna resolve it. If it's a big thing, and that is somewhat subjective in the eye of the beholder when you use words like materially, then it should be worked out. So I'm not sure materially is a helpful term here. I think it's a pretty ambiguous term.
I will say that was added by the drafters, not by DOJ or by us, as part of their formatting of the statute for consistency. So we can go back and have a conversation with them about it, but that was the origin of that language, as they went through their template for this kind of stuff.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anything else on section 13? Yeah, Colin, go ahead.
Yeah, I just raised my hand again because I originally had a question about unrelated to that topic. I was just curious, Matt, could you give a hypothetical example of where section 2 might come into play?
That's a great question. As soon as we started talking about the Administrative Procedures Act and trying to say that this is going to be a state agency that doesn't have to comply with the Administrative Procedures Act, it seemed like something that might be too big of a bite, and that we might need to have something that provides some of those due process protections as a just in case something comes up. And Jeff and I talked about this, and I think we may have come up with some examples, but nothing's coming to my mind right now. If there's anything that this agency does that violates somebody's due process rights, they've got to have a way of recourse. And this is just that pressure relief valve to say they can get into court and they have something that they could latch on to say this is their basis for challenging the agency action. But no, off the top of my head right now, I'm not thinking of anything in particular that could raise that issue.
Yeah, and we didn't, tossing somebody off for trespass or taking particular action against an individual was what came to my mind, that due process protections should apply. And we didn't want to make, and I think also this came from Legislative Council. There was some discussion with them about making sure that there wasn't a gap that would render the statute subject to challenge for violating constitutional protections due process. So we put this in order to be safe.
Thanks for the explanation. Anything else on section 13?
So Peter, on sections 14 through 21,
Yeah.
Matt's prepared to he can go two ways. He can kind of do a thumbnail sentence or two about each one and succession, or he can just describe the intent around those 6 or 7 provisions collectively, and then we can talk about specifics if people want to, however you want to handle it.
Well, let me turn it to the group. Does anybody want specifics? Sort of a specific item, provision by provision walkthrough, or is the lump approach okay?
I think it would be helpful if you explained them in whole first, because when I read this last night, kind of out of context, and I think maybe it was Mark had a question about this. I was reading things about the state forester, and it kind of just, it was, granted it was 10 o'clock at night, but it didn't make sense to me. And when I looked at it this morning, and I actually pulled up the statutes that it referenced, it made sense that it was being amended to strike those terms from the existing statutes. So if you can maybe explain that, that might be helpful.
Start big and go narrow as needed, Matt.
That sounds great. And yeah, Colin, I think you hit it right on the head. These are the existing statutes that describe how the Elliott State Forest is currently managed. So this was where Legislative Council went into existing statutes and said, here's all the places where we've got to extricate the Elliott State Forest from the existing structure. So there's lots of references to the Department of Forestry and the State Forester And what those are doing is they are saying the state forester has all these same obligations for the common school forest lands, but we're going to take the Elliott State Forest out of that management role. So yes, Colin, you hit it right on the head. One of the statutes that I think you're going to be most interested in is in sections 14 and 15 that relate to disposition or sale of the Elliott State Forest. And the language that's in here, what it's intended to do is to say that this statute is going to be pulled out of the ORS 530, and it's going to now live in LC 54. Wherever this new bill gets put into the statutes, it's going to carry with it the language from 530, 450. It's just going to have a different numerical designation. And we had proposed some changes to that language to make it more clear in what situations an exchange could be done, since we're not going to have the same exchange criteria that currently exist in statute. It's going to have to be updated a little bit to talk about the research forest management purposes. But otherwise, the language will still be there that the forest is withdrawn from sale, except as allowed for exchanges that are of equal size and work to consolidate the forest. That'll all still stay in there. And then sections 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 are all changes that remove the Elliott State Forest from the current Board of Forestry State Forester management function. Oh, I'm sorry, that stopping at section 20. Section 21 gets into the COPs from 2017. That's a separate issue. So I'll pause there as far as the common school forest land management piece.
I'll respond to something in the chat box on the delineation of what exactly is the Elliott State Forest. I think it's in section 2, sub 1. We looked at how do we delineate exactly what is going to be in the research forest, what's not. And we used the reserve, South Slough Estuarine Reserve process as the template for defining and delineating what is the Elliott State Research Forest. And so the language of having the land board delineate that is the template that we landed on. So that's the answer to a question that was just asked.
Other questions or comments related to sections 14 through 20? Okay. Matt, did you want to tackle 21 separately?
Yes, please.
All right.
So section 21 is about the certificates of participation for $100 million from 2017, 2018. Legislative Council's perspective was that these are certificates of participation that we've already exercised. It's now superfluous language that we could get out of statute. We pushed back a little bit on that and said, well, we thought that it could be useful in the future to have a second certificate of participation should it become necessary. And Ledge Council's response was, well, these are changes to statute that are not going to come into play until the Elliott State Forest is fully decoupled. So from Ledge Council's perspective, once this becomes operative, there will be full decoupling and there will be no reason to exercise a COP option. So we have the language that's in there now, but I would just add that it's under some further discussions, and DSL may want to push back and have some more conversations with Ledge Council about this change.
Thanks, Matt. Any additions, questions, or clarifications? Yeah, Colin.
Something that came to my mind reading these sections is without decoupling the revenues from the Elliott go to the common school fund. And I think the intent is for after decoupling for those revenues to go back into operation of the Elliott. And then if there's anything left over for that, those funds to stay with research on the Elliott. And I didn't see anything that stood out to me as requiring that. And I'm wondering if there's language in this draft legislation that would prohibit, if there's excess revenue from the sale of carbon credits or forest products or anything like that, if there's anything to prohibit the state from sweeping those funds and using them for purposes unrelated to research on the Elliott.
Jeff, do you want me to respond?
I believe we've got it covered, but the site's escaping me. So Malia or Matt, you might have the site.
Matt, if you want to start, and then if necessary, I can add on.
Okay.
Okay.
We have been working with Ledge Council on some language for creation of a fund that would be the fund for the research authority. And we weren't able to get it completed in time to get into this draft, but I think we've got some pretty good models from what the Department of Forestry does that are ready to go into a draft. And in essence, what they're going to do is they're going to create a new fund. They're going to say that all revenue from the forest is placed into this fund and that the authority has continuous appropriations, or the funds are continuously available to the authority to spend for the purposes of this act. So we have that language available. It's not in here yet. And the concern that the legislature could come back and sweep that and put it to other purposes is unfortunately something that I don't think we could prevent. If the legislature creates this entity and dedicates funds to it, the legislature can change its mind at any point in the future.
And the only thing I'll add to that is that, as Matt said, we are working on that language. It just wasn't quite ready for this, but it's pretty standard fund creation language that is used when a new entity or agency is established.
Yeah, and my addition is that one of the things we're trying to make sure is in that language is the ability for the board to accept funds from other sources without having to seek prior approval, so that they're not gummed up in the works of having to go to the legislature to ask for permission to receive a grant from the federal government or a donation from the OSU Foundation or whatever it might be. So we've been working on that language just over the last several days. And I think, Matt, the Treasurer's Office counsel has been involved in that too. So Treasurer's Office is weighing in on how those funds have to be worded. And there's nothing that Malia and I really have to add other than kind of the general policy direction. It's really some highly technical stuff that the right people are crafting the wording for.
Thanks. Ryan, did you want to jump in on this? No.
No, I was going to say they had a couple minor tweaks. The big distinction that I was able to confirm with our team at Treasury was this will be a public agency, and as such will have a fund structure that is typical of a public agency. Their question was if it's a semi-independent or another type, then it changes the cash management and banking relationship. We would not have that cash management and banking relationship with Treasury, but since it will be a public agency, it'll look similar to a lot of other state agencies and will allow for the possibility of federal funds and private funds and everything like that.
Thanks, Ryan. Colin, thanks for the question. Anything else on this section 21?
One other point, if I could add, is
Please.
In relation to, so the section 21 is about certificates of participation. Two other ways that could be available for funding would be a revenue bond or an Article 11Q bond. And we're also talking to Legislative Council about adding in provisions to give this authority the opportunity to participate in bond sales. That is also language that is in draft form, but not ready enough to go into this draft, but may appear in the next draft or a -1 amendment.
Thanks, Matt. Delayed implementation and the sunset provisions, sections 22 and 23. Comments or questions? We've talked a fair amount about these.
I'll go after after you've dealt with everybody else's, or if there isn't any. DSL has a couple things to note on this one. Okay.
Why don't you go ahead, Jeff?
So I've been working a little bit with the School Board Association on the decoupling, the languaging of the decoupling that we got back was not quite what we had put in, and so there's going to be some adjustments to that. I, as recently as this morning, was talking to the School Board Association to make sure that we were aligned with them on how that languaging should be accomplished. So you'll see the bill that's introduced has slightly different language than this. I think it actually might be taken care of in that bill as opposed to in the -1 amendments, but I wanted to call it out for everybody. Still a precondition to the act being implemented is decoupling, satisfactory decoupling, but and the financial arrangements for that to happen. And then under C, working with ICF and the folks that have been working on the HCP for the department that you all have heard you've heard Troy talk several times, just to make sure that this language is right. It came back a little different, and I believe that it's going to change to be pursuant to the National Environmental Policy Act. Not, I think it's a NEPA process that's issuing the record of decision, not the Endangered Species Act. But I'm not positive about that, and I've asked the question. I'm waiting for an answer. So you might see a minor language change there.
Thanks, Jeff. Any questions for Jeff on that, or additional comments or questions on these two elements? Okay. All right, moving on. Section 24, appropriations.
Ryan, do you want to take this one? Because I think we've talked about it at length today with the Treasury Department.
Yeah, so this one I think was just added in by the editors as sort of boilerplate language that is not necessary. And so I actually asked Legislative Council just to remove this section, pending further developments. This bill will end up in Ways and Means, and whether a specific dollar figure is articulated in this bill or not can be decided at a later date. To be honest, just going in with a bill with a blank spot just raises questions that aren't, necessary at this particular stage.
So Ryan, did you say 24 was coming out?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Any comments or questions related to that as opposed to the language, knowing that that language is no longer in there?
And I'll just offer, as I did earlier, that when Melissa and I and Jeff and Malia spoke to the Coastal Caucus of the legislators, that was an issue that we brought up with them, and we're clear that there would be an ask at some point down the line, just so there was no surprise with that group of Salem types.
And in the public chat, we have a question, and I can just answer it. The agency fiscal that will be requested that would be attached to this bill would be what sends it to Ways and Means, even if this section isn't in the bill.
Thanks.
So I-
Katie, Jeff? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I do have just, I mean, this is a total strategy question, maybe more so than what's, the words on the paper, but, I do know that, the governor has requested 120. And for the decoupling, and I'm just wondering, to have that message consistent, why not put that in the bill?
Well, Ryan, do you want to?
Sorry to put you guys on the spot.
No, and I'll go ahead, Jeff.
There are different vehicles for moving the appropriation through, and we want to be clear that we've got as many different vehicles in play as possible, and not have this particular substantive bill be interpreted as the only vehicle. That's the simplest explanation I can give of our thinking.
Yeah, and I thought there was just the risk of sort of having this blank spot of the perception that there's costs associated with, with the preparation to move, and not necessarily for the decoupling. And so it was really just because it wasn't something we requested to be in, and it isn't necessary to be in at this stage. We thought it was cleanest to leave it out. And
I totally get that. That makes sense. I was just kind of curious on the other end. So sorry to throw you all in the hot spot.
Oh,
no problem.
That's what we're here for.
Right.
Thanks, Ryan and Jeff, for the clarification. Katie, for the question. Tom, welcome. We're taking it section by section, and you may be pleased to know that we're approaching the end. The section by section walkthrough. Section 25, standard form language. Standard. Bob, you're off mute. Do you have something on this?
No, sorry.
You can be off mute. I just didn't know if that was for a reason.
I'm having end of the day chaos. Like probably.
Challenger, I thought if you had questions about section 25, we were going to have to woodshed you or something. That
standard effective date.
I do have a couple of questions of things we missed when we get to sort of round up.
Great. Yeah, that was my very next question is, are there questions, topics, concerns, elements that have not been raised over the course of the section by section walkthrough that bear mentioning, knowing that we don't have the full group here and may not be able to address these in their entirety? And then before we conclude the meeting, I want to talk scheduling and when we might be able to get people together to with time for answers, and then and data collection, and then try to resolve a few of these things before we get to that Wednesday deadline. So Bob, you were first in the queue for any unmentioned topics so far, and then it looks like maybe Katie fast.
Yeah, two related things. I just curious about public records and also an administrative record if there is litigation. We've talked about that at different points, the need to be able to access under public records law, but also if we need to produce an administrative record, who's on, is there responsibility for that in here?
So Matt and I we know that you want to talk public meetings and public records laws and the applicability of those without being delineated in the bill. So Matt, go ahead and have at it.
Sure, thank you. So there's section 11, and then the very last subsection 3 provides that the public records law, ORS 192, 311 to 431, applies to the authority. So they are obligated to comply with public records law, and that would be for any state agency, but is made all the more clear with the language there. And then the public meetings law is addressed as well in section 6, subsection 2. The board of directors constitutes the governing body for purposes of public meetings law set forth in ORS 196, 610 to 690. So again, it's a state entity. The governing body of that state entity would be under the obligation of the public meetings law, and that's made clear in this section as well. As far as the administrative record, I guess my response to that would be that there is also going to be the obligation to retain records. The records retention schedule is going to apply to this authority. And if a public records request is made, the agency or the entity, the authority is going to be obligated to retain and then provide those records to anybody that requests them. And if there's a challenge under the APA, the authority is going to have to put on evidence to support its actions and would have to retain those records to prove its case.
Yeah, the other than contested case process under the APA brings in virtually any document that the agency has, and just in the context of relevancy, as opposed to having a set of documents that are labeled a particular administrative record that you might see in a different, in some of the different processes that are not going to be part of the third-party review. So it's actually broader in the obligation and the availability of documents to support a third-party action challenging something that the board has done. It's a wide open slate of what can be used and based on what's retained as a public record, period, as opposed to gathering documents together and having the agency label them.
That's super helpful. Matt, I'm wondering if we can get like 15 minutes of your time potentially on Thursday afternoon. I know when we sit back down with our lawyers, we're going to get a million questions. I think we can resolve a lot of them based on today, but it'd be super helpful if maybe we could grab 15 minutes of your time on Thursday to round out things. Probably save us a lot of time on Friday and next week.
And that's, Bob, that's specific to, I would guess, the APA, or are you looking at public?
Yeah,
public
it's basically the APA section. You know, just so we can run legal questions by you. I think we got a lot of answers today, but I'm sure more will come up when we meet, and we are meeting. Mark, do you know when we're meeting on Thursday?
I don't recall the time in the afternoon, I believe.
Okay, I'll find it, but that'd be super if we can just grab a few minutes of your time to follow up on a few things.
Would you include me on that communication, Bob?
Yes.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, I am under the direction of Jeff. So if Jeff tells me I can attend, then I will attend.
He absolutely can.
All right, appreciate that.
And by the way, for any of the working group members, the same offer is there for you as well. And I guess I can leave it up to each of you about whether or not you want to invite other working group members into an informal conversation like that. But we're happy to meet with you individually with Matt, with Malia and I, whatever you want to answer questions that you have.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks. Any other items that weren't raised over the course of our walkthrough of the section by section that bear mentioning with the group before we turn our attention to next steps?
Francis reminds me we're meeting at noon, so we're meeting noon to 2, so probably around 2 o'clock on Thursday, Matt and Jeff.
Thanks. We'll trust you all. We'll coordinate there. In terms of meeting, again, knowing Melissa was able to listen into a portion of today's meeting, but also was dealing with flight logistics, and Paul was unavailable. I have requested each of them for their availability late this week and early next week. Are folks available either? I'm assuming we're talking Friday or Monday. is there a preference between those 2 days? And if so, that's both based on availability as well as how much time Matt, you, Malia, Jeff, Katie, and others need in terms of sort of based on today's conversation. There's some ground truthing and background work that needs to be done. And it'd be great to come into the next conversation with as much information as possible on some of these elements. Monday's at MLK Day. Thanks. Federal holiday for many people, I imagine, on the call. Tuesday.
Either afternoon, Monday or Friday is great for me.
I think we should try to go with Friday. I think the more we can front load this, given our timeline, the better. I can do Friday afternoon too, after 2.
Anybody not available on Friday afternoon?
I'm booked 2 to 3 on Friday. Otherwise, I'm available.
I'm not available after 3.
I am tentatively out on Friday, but if Paul's available, we're covered. And Shannon.
Yeah, I can be there.
Available after 2.
I can be there anytime.
Later the better.
Later the better. Although it sounded like Tom's only available 2 to 3. Is that right? Can we do 2 to 4 or 2 to 5? Hold that 3-hour chunk, and we'll get as much done as quickly as possible. And then if we need to bleed it into Monday or Tuesday morning, we'll do that. Okay. We'll send out a scheduler. I'm going to do that with a caveat. We still need to ground truth that availability with Melissa and Paul. There is a bit of a precedent that late Friday afternoon has worked for many of you in the past, much to your own chagrin. But anything else for the good of the order today?
Peter, just making sure, I think you lose Colin from 2 to 3.
Yeah, I think I heard that too.
Oh, did I miss that? Okay.
Yeah, I'll see what I can do there, but it's not looking promising.
If Paul and Shannon are there I don't know about Randy, what your schedule's like, but we'll work it out. Just don't hold back because of me.
And Colin, let's try to, if you're not able to rearrange, we will try to make sure that somebody has touched base with you ahead of time to flag key issues. And then if needed, we can address them in the 3 to 4 timeframe as well.
Sounds good.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. We'll send out a calendar invite with details. In the meantime, continue to, we know this was a short turnaround for review of this and providing feedback. Do noted for Mark reserving the right to flag additional topics once you've had time to pore over this and with, more time to sit on it. So please do so though, knowing that it is a tight turnaround here still. Malia, anything else before we go?
No, just again, I agree with Bob. I think the more we can front load this, given our timeline, especially the first of next week is going to go quick with the holiday there. So, yeah.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Please use your phones to call with questions, comments, suggestions.
I